This is not an official podcast of the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution, NSDAR, and does not necessarily represent the position of the NSDAR. This interview is being conducted for the Daughter Dialogues Oral History Project. The interviewer is Risha Rainey. The narrator is Sharri Phillips. Sharri, please tell me, where were you born?
I was born in the city of Flint, Michigan.
Tell me about your parents. Where are they from?
My father was born in Flint, Michigan, and my mother was born in Detroit, Michigan.
Did they both work? And if so, what did they do for a living?
My father was a dairy farmer, and he is retired. And my mother, she was one of the only women that we knew that was a working wife. Most of them were stay-at-home wives back in her time. But at her height, she became the director of special education for the Lapeer County Intermediate School District.
Tell me about your childhood growing up and kind of what shaped you and molded you to who you are today.
My family actually lived in Lapeer, Michigan, which is in the thumb area of the MIT of Michigan. MITT, I guess is how you spell it. There were just farmers around. It was very rural. So my road might have had 3 or 4 farms to the south and a few farms to the north. And we were spread out quite a bit, quite a distance. Now, when I was born, though, it was socially a year after the United States Supreme Court decided Brown v. Board of Education. And that case overturned the law at the time, which was represented the doctrine of separate but equal. So in 1954, the ways in the United States were around separate but equal. So that by that I mean that whites and blacks were separate in all public facilities, especially in the South. So you had separate water fountains, you had separate restrooms, you had separate entrances for restaurants, and you had restrictive covenants in the sale of homes. So, it was in the covenant when you sold your home that you were not to sell to black people. And these were all vestiges of slavery that still lingered on for decades after President Abraham Lincoln signed the 13th Amendment emancipating the slaves. So there was an era following the signing of the 13th Amendment called Reconstruction. And then Reconstruction evolved into another phase of Reconstruction, which basically many Jim Crow laws were instituted, and that's when I was born. My life started as one of the greatest periods of social upheaval that America has experienced.
What was it like growing up on a dairy farm? That must have been a really unique experience as a child.
It was for black people in the North because mostly black farmers existed in the South at that time. So it was quite a bit of physical labor, a lot of work. My father farmed 360 acres and by himself because my brother was still too young, or if he needed assistance, we could help him on some things. Such as when he had to do the haying, and we could receive the bales off the elevator and stack them on the wagon as he drove the fields. And then we could unload the bales as he sent them up another elevator, which was higher. He could send them up the elevator into the haymow where my brother and I were up in the haymow, and we could take the bales off the elevator and place them in the haymow so that, it didn't get over, the bales didn't pile up right under the elevator. So we had to shift them around. We could take care of feeding the livestock, feeding the calves, and what we call bedding down the cows, which would entail dragging the bales from the barn across the barnyard or carrying them, whatever we could handle, because we were just little, And then we'd take them into the pen barn and spread it out on the floor of the pen barn so that the cows could come into the barnyard at night, out of the pasture into the barnyard, and sleep in the pen barn on some clean straw or hay, whatever we were putting down, straw probably. And that way they weren't resting in manure. They generated quite a bit of manure, so that had to be scraped out of the barnyard on a frequent basis and cleared out and spread onto the fields. So that manure would be fertilizer. Yeah, it was pretty hard work, and in the summer it was very hot. So I could only imagine how it was down south when Africans were enslaved in all that heat, and in some cases in swampy areas with snakes and all kinds of insects and gators and what have you that they were contending with. So yeah, it was very hard work, and my father worked very, very hard, very hard. He did a good job. He was quite a businessman. So, and he was well respected in the community.
Tell me about the home, the actual home that you lived in and the school that you attended.
We lived in an old farmhouse. It was built in 1846. That's when the construction started on it. And it started out as a small cabin that was a kitchen and a couple of bedrooms off the kitchen. And then over time, the home expanded. It was a large farmhouse, and it had 6 bedrooms. And we lived together with my grandparents, my parents, and the grandchildren, which would be myself and my brother and sister. The house had a Michigan basement, which is a dirt basement that the foundation is made of stone. So it was kind of a spooky place as well. And my father tried to fix it up as best he could, but it was just an old place. It was very drafty. And over time, my dad and grandfather installed a indoor restroom and a bathroom downstairs, and then later on there was one upstairs, and installed a fuel oil furnace because we were on coal prior to that time. So in the winter it was cold. When we had the coal furnace, it would burn out in the middle of the night, and then in the morning my father would get up and stoke it up again and start heating the house. And we had also a wood burning stove in the kitchen that we sometimes used, especially when we lost electricity. And it was kind of lovely. It was kind of a lovely way to live. It was very frontierish, and I enjoyed that. I really did. But it had its drawbacks because it was very cold in the winter. Very cold in that house.
Tell me about your school.
My school was a one-room schoolhouse. It had the grades kindergarten through 4th grade in it, and there were 30 to 40 children in the school, and my grade had maybe 5 children in my grade. But we were all in one room with one teacher, and she would do the lessons for each grade every day, and then we would listen to those lessons and do whatever our assignment or our homework was while the other grades were having their classes, and we could also listen in, and then we could also help each other. I think we had a really good education. By the time I went to school, it was 1960. It was like we were in 1860. It was it wasn't sophisticated like city people.
What were the demographics of the students?
It's mostly white. In my school, I was the only Black person, and since I was the oldest child, I was kind of cutting a lot of ice in that community for my siblings. And so when I went to school, I didn't know I was a Black person until I went to school. And then my schoolmates let me know that I was Black because, there were racial slurs used on me. There was some fights that broke out because I wasn't going to tolerate that. Even though I was a little kid, I was proud of myself. I didn't want to tolerate all of that. During the recess, I'm sure the teacher was aware, but she really didn't intervene at all. It was very difficult to join in with the other children because I was almost like being shunned. So everyone else got the message that I was to be socially isolated, and our community was less progressive than the city areas were. I was always a smart student, so I had that going for me. And I was always top of my class, so I had a lot going for me, but the social part was a little bit difficult, especially for a child to overcome. And I don't really know if my parents were aware. They were so busy working. I don't know that they were totally aware of what was going on with me, although my mother did have to go to the school several times over things that were happening to me. And it was on us to overcome it. The teachers probably really didn't even know what to do about it. So even the children that we knew, because our mothers were friends, so we would visit their home, because they lived like adjacent to our farm and down the road and so forth. So there were some children that I knew already before I went to school, but they didn't act like they knew me when we were at school in the beginning. We transferred when I was in the 4th grade, so I was sent to a school where the whole classroom was 4th graders. And then I went to the junior high school. At White Junior High is the first time I saw another Black student. Then when I got to high school, there was a boy who was in my grade. But there was a family in town. My father's uncle had a sister-in-law, and the sister married a Caucasian man, and they ended up living in Lapeer. So we were aware of them and knew them, and they did visit back and forth with my father or grandfather, but I did not know their children personally. I knew one of them in school because it was a girl. She was about my age, maybe she was my brother's age, a little younger. But I didn't associate with her, but I was aware of her. The family I just spoke about was Johnson.
At the age of 16, you were selected to be a soloist, a soprano soloist. Tell me about that.
Okay, so I come from a musical family on both sides. My grandfather had an extremely beautiful tenor operatic voice, my grandfather on my father's side, and my grandmother on my mother's side was a music major at Cass Technical High School in Detroit. And so she played the piano and she played the violin and the harp. That was her major. But on my grandfather's side, actually one of his relatives was Phyllis Marshall. So she was a famous TV personality and jazz singer in Ontario, Canada. And she also played in one of the movies from the Muppets, the Jim Henson Muppets. There was a movie that she played one of the characters. It was a cat that she played, but it was in her character, very glamorous and jazzy, soulful voice. And my aunt, my father's sister, she was very musical as well, had a beautiful voice, and she was a teacher, but she would moonlight in singing in nightclubs and so forth. And she was very glamorous and beautiful too, with a beautiful voice. Coming up, I was always in the band. I played piano. I had piano lessons as a young child. And when I got into junior high school, I played woodwind instrument, the clarinet. And then in high school, I played the oboe. And then I joined the choir at high school. I was the first soprano, and I sang solo on our record that we made in school. I guess I must have been about 16 when that record was made. And that was the same year I auditioned for a choral group in Michigan called the Southern Michigan Youth Chorale. And primarily because I wanted to go to Europe. But we visited 7 countries, and in each country we would do we would perform a concert. So in England, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, Austria, Switzerland, Germany, and we were led by a Dr. John Tavares, who was a music professor at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan.
Who funded this? How did this chorale come about? And how did you come about being a part of this opportunity? And how was it funded to have you travel as a group?
Well, we just paid for our own trip, and we could, my mother came as one of the chaperones and so forth, but she was enjoying her trip too, you know. Most of them were from cities like down toward Detroit. Yeah, so it was a very eye-opening experience, and my mother wanted to give me that because even though we grew up in the country, we were very intelligent people, and she wanted to expose me, and she knew to do that.
You also won beauty pageants at that age?
Yes, the following year, when I was 17, the JCs had sponsored. Actually, they had purchased a franchise in the Miss America pageant. And so in order to become a Miss America, you have to start out as a local queen. You have to win a local title. Then you go to your state and you have to win Miss Michigan in my case. And then you go to Miss America, the Miss America pageant. My friends, they encouraged me to apply. And so at that time you had to have a talent. You have to appear in a swimsuit. You have to appear in a formal. You have to be interviewed by the judges and asked a lot of questions. They will grill you on, current events or whatever. And you'd have to be in position to fulfill all of that. And then in addition, once you would be crowned, then you had to serve for a year at public events and represent the county. Part of the prize package was that you got scholarship money. You got like a whole year of finishing school, which was in Detroit. So my mother transported me once a week. She would pick me up from my college and take me to Detroit for finishing school.
So you won the pageant.
Oh, yes, I did. Now, I wasn't encouraged. I was told that it wasn't going to be possible for me to win it, but as it turned out, I did. I did win it. And even it was a miracle because on the night, like when I went to perform my talent, the microphone was not on. So I just had to sing as loudly as I could.
Which pageant and what was your title?
I won the Miss Lapeer County pageant. And my title was Miss Lapeer County. So I was crowned. So at the end of your year, you get sent to the Miss Michigan pageant. That's part of what your responsibilities are. You have to run for Miss Michigan. And as I recall, there were about 50 girls from around the state of Michigan in the Miss Michigan pageant. But then the first Black or African American Miss America was Vanessa L. Williams, who is the singer and actress that we know today. And she was crowned in 1983. So she came 10 years after me. By the time the Miss Michigan pageant occurred, it was 1974. It was still a time of great prejudice. I was coming into my formative years, my teenage years, and my adult years during a very socially tumultuous time. And I was on the edge of it. So everything that happened, I was like one of the first groups of people to be implemented with the implementation of the new laws that were coming into place. And so it crossed over into every aspect, including the pageants. When I was 17, it was still prevalent. And then going to college, it was still there because people thought you didn't belong in college. People thought I didn't belong in the pageant. I was told that when I got to the Miss Michigan that the judges were discussing that they couldn't have me win, because, you're used as for advertising, you're used for commercials, you're used for all kinds of public relations things. And the sponsors, the one in particular, said there's no way that she can win. I did make the top 10 at Miss Michigan, but I didn't get, second or first runner up or anything like that. But, I think that's probably for the best, because it was a lot of extreme pressure on a very young person. It was a lot of pressure. Being the first one to cut through, being under a microscope, very, very tough microscope. Yeah, it was a rough go. It was very hard. And you had to prove yourself when you were, it was on you to prove yourself, whereas everybody else had the benefit of the doubt. You know what I mean? So it was a lot of pressure. And I was striving to do my best at every step. And I wasn't going to stop. I wasn't going to be inhibited. That's the other thing. I had a very strong backbone from my family. And I was determined. I was very determined. And I wasn't scared of too much. So I would go into areas where prior to my time, people like me were not going. They would be afraid to go. They wouldn't go. And I was stepping into those areas every time I turned around, because I was curious and I wanted to achieve goals in my life. Because going back to my birth date, born on the 4th of July, from a very young age, I felt very special. And by the time I was 5 years old, I told my mother, she didn't tell me, I told her, there is some destiny for me. Now, I don't know if I achieved it or not. So I've had a lot of success, but in order to get that, you have to fall in the ditch quite a bit and pick yourself up and dust yourself off and keep going. So that's how I kind of view it. It's been very difficult, very hard work to come from where I was and to achieve what I did achieve. It's been a lot of hard work.
Where did you attend college?
My undergraduate college was Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan, which was a part of Michigan State University, and then it broke off and became an independent school.
What did you study?
My major was economics. I was a young person that I was business oriented. I could analyze things and figure it out.
You went on to study law.
Yes. So this is one of those areas where I had a backstep. So I graduated from Oakland University. I was accepted at the University of Michigan, which is the best school in Michigan and one of the top 10 universities in the United States. But because of the money situation, I accepted the invitation to go to Oakland University. They offered me basically a full scholarship. After I graduated from Oakland University, I was accepted in law school in Toledo, Ohio, at the University of Toledo. Life happened, and I had to withdraw in my second year. I withdrew, came home, and started to work. So prior to that time, I had worked as a high school student. I had worked for a law firm in my hometown, and that man employed me every summer I came home from school, except for my senior year. I worked for Abstract and Title Company because that was related to the law in my mind. There were openings at the General Motors Tech Center. By then I was about 24. So I actually spent 30 years at General Motors Corporation, working in various jobs, but working my way up into the personnel area. I worked in EEO, which was great. It was law associated, and that's equal employment opportunity. And I got a lot of experience writing up cases and so forth, because people were saying they were being discriminated against, and there was some kind of class action suit that General Motors had been under at that time. And then from there, I went to a service area. So, we were administering programs for employees, salaried employees in that area. And then from that area, I self-nominated to go into labor relations, which I thought was the best fit in the personnel activity for me. So in labor relations, you're dealing with the UAW, the United Automobile Workers Union, and I got experience with another union, which was called the OPEIU, the Office of Professional Employees International Union. Got to handle the grievance procedure, got to handle employee benefits for the OPEIU. And then with General Motors, eventually I became a negotiator for the national collective bargaining process. It was very rewarding work, very, very good work. And then before I retired, I had transferred into the arbitration and wage administration activity. But during my 30 years, I decided to go back and complete that law degree. So I basically started again because it had been 16 years and started over again. And I achieved my law degree at night while I was working full time. So basically for 4 years, I got up at like 4:30 in the morning. I went to work. I studied a little bit before work, at lunch, a little bit after work, drove to Detroit. My law school was, it's known as Michigan State University Law School today, but at that time it was in Detroit, located in Detroit, and it was called Detroit College of Law. But I wanted to complete that very badly, and I did it. There were other things in between. I also had an interest in becoming bilingual in a foreign language, and my language that I chose was German. It wasn't my first choice, but it was what I could get in this area that was meaningful to me because I also have a German heritage, so I thought I would do that. And I did get it was a lot of work. It took me 5 years, but I became moderately fluent. And I did attend a 2-week, it wasn't enough, but they call it immersion class in Munich, Germany when I was in my 50s. When I went there by myself. I lived in a German neighborhood where they didn't speak much English because mostly in Europe, everybody can speak English because they learn it in school from a very young age. But I wanted immersion, so I went to a neighborhood that was not English-speaking neighborhood. I stayed in a German-speaking neighborhood. And I caught the train every day to the school, which was the Goethe Institute is where I attended. And then also at school, half a day was spent doing cultural things out in the community. Or sometimes one time we got on the train and we went to Austria. And, I went to that, what's that guy? I can't remember the name of the thing that we saw, but it's the castle that Disneyland has modeled their logo after.
Neuschwanstein.
That's it. So we went there, Neuschwanstein. I really enjoyed that. And it kind of proved to myself after studying for several years, by that time it was 4 to 5 years, that I could actually get a foreign language in my head. For a fully developed adult to learn and accept a foreign language is difficult because it means that you have to throw away your culture, because in order to get a language into your brain, you have to accept the culture that goes with it. You have to think like a German. And if you're not in that culture, it's very difficult to do that. And that's what prevents people from being able to speak the language, So I was in an area that's not a strong German-speaking area, but there are some people there. They call it Deutschverein. It's a club, you can join. There's several of those. So I joined one of those, and we have an area called Frankenmuth, which is not as German as it used to be, but there used to be some German speakers there. I don't think so, not so much so today, but I would go there. There would be Oktoberfests and different things. I would just participate as much as I could in America, but at a point, I just had to go to Germany and see how I would do. So,
after you obtained your law degree, did you practice law?
Yes. So I was still working at General Motors in 2008. General Motors went bankrupt. If you recall that horrible downturn that we had in our economy. All the car companies were in trouble. They had to slim down their workforce. So that's when I retired. I took a year off. I went to design school. It was actually fashion design. So I learned how to sew better, how to design. And then I decided I have to hang out my shingle, use my degree, try to earn some extra money. And that's when I opened up my law practice. And so that was 2010. I practiced for 10 years. And I'm at the point now where I'm ready to retire. So I had my last court hearing 2 weeks ago by Zoom. And so I've closed all my cases and I really can retire at this point. So,
why did you choose to practice law?
It was suggested to me by my mother because there weren't many women in law at that time. I was going to be on the first wave of women in law school. I was employed by a lawyer in town. His name was Richard Bales, and he encouraged me. And so I thought, well, that is the direction I will strike out in.
Why would your mother want you to be one of the first women? Wouldn't that just make your path harder? Wasn't your path already hard enough, as you explained?
No, my mom wanted me to get into a good, solid profession. And I had the capability, and so she made that suggestion to me, and I took it up.
What area of practice did you go into?
When I finally practiced, I was 55. Even though I had been involved with the Bar Association in prior years, I was the president of the D. Augusta Straker Bar Association in Troy, Michigan, which is a special purpose bar association for African American attorneys. I had been its president. We won the National Bar Association Outstanding Chapter Affiliate when I was president for the bar year 1999-2000. And I chose to go into what I thought would be an area where I can serve people well and also keep my interest in families. So I wanted to work with children and the elderly. So my practice focused on child welfare law, juvenile delinquency, and probate law. So my practice was court-appointed work. So I was appointed to represent indigent people. It turned out to be something different than what I thought. In the communities, we really don't have many resources or enough resources for the type of need that these vulnerable people require. And also led to my thoughts of retiring because there's only so much one person can do about that. And it didn't seem like I could change the world in that area.
Did you marry?
I married as an older person.
How old were you?
I was almost 34 years old. He works for General Motors at the tech center, and that's where he still works, and I met him there. He comes from a very good family, and his father was an otolaryngologist, but also an eye surgeon. And so he was, from what I remember or recall being told to me, the first Black doctor admitted into practicing at the hospital, and that would be Mercy Hospital in Detroit, I believe. And his name was Dr. Burton E. Phillips. And my husband is Stephen Michael Phillips.
Did you have children?
I don't have any children. It kind of passed me by. I was getting too old. I wanted to have a large family, but I would have had to have gotten married a lot younger, I think. I wanted to say something about my mother-in-law too. And her name was Emily Guillory Phillips. She's a Guillory from Louisiana, and they had a very interesting history. She called herself Cajun, but probably Creole is a good descriptor of her background too. They were farmers, so she was a farmer's daughter like I was. And so we kind of struck it off together, and we kind of looked alike. We were both tall, slim, and we had a certain carriage, and so people assumed we were mother and daughter. When she died, one of my best friends who was in our wedding said to me, "I think Stephen married his mama." she was something else. And she came a long way in her life, being on a farm, all the way to getting herself educated, even though she didn't even speak English till she was 16 years old. Her parents both were dead by the time she was 16, so she became a registered nurse and worked in private practice for wealthy people.
How did you discover that you had an ancestor who contributed to the American Revolution?
I always knew it, but genealogy is something that I was interested in from extremely young age, probably 7 years old. And I asked my grandmother and great-grandmother a question about it, and that would be my mother's mother and grandmother, and they started to tell me about my history on the line where my patriot is, but they were very reticent about telling me anything, because what they said was, don't talk about this because nobody will ever believe you. So evidently that's what they were told when they were coming up, that no one would believe it. Like I said, I knew at a very young age that I was special somehow. I didn't know how special until I was old enough to explore what they had told me at that age about my lineage. And then, of course, the tools became more available because everything became automated and so forth. It was a secret. So that's how, what got me to apply to the DAR was that there's only certain people that are interested in genealogy. I'm just one of the people in my family that is, and actually takes action on it. So my mother said to me, one day she says, aren't we eligible to become members of the DAR? And I immediately said, yes. And then I got on the computer, and then I was able to find our patriot immediately because in my case, quite a few of my lines are very prominent people. And the one where my patriot is extremely prominent, founders of the country type of line. So I could easily just look on the computer and say who was a patriot of the Revolutionary War. Now, I don't have just one. I've got a lot of patriots, as many of us do, because as you know from doing your own research, is that when you have one, quite often you have two. So if you have an ancestral set of grandparents, frequently the man and his son were in the revolution together, and on the mother's side, her father and his father were in the revolution, you know? So you have, like, when you find one, you find 8, you know, that far back. And that's just on one line.
Tell me about the patriot that you have listed with the DAR officially right now that you've joined on.
Yeah, well, it only takes one to become a member. And so I just went after the one that was the most direct. And like I said, I started genealogy as a very young person, so I had been collecting information for more than 40 years. So I had everything that I needed. But his name is Green Clay. And Green Clay is a person who, his lineage goes back to the state of Virginia before the forming of the United States of America. So as far back as we can go, his ancestor, and it's all well documented because this family documented themselves, and then other people documented them as they became more and more prominent in society. So Green Clay was known as the first genealogist of the Clay family. So his ancestor was John Clay, who came from England. John Clay was a soldier, and he was a soldier on the ship, the Treasurer. And the Treasurer was one of two ships that brought the first Africans to Point Comfort, Virginia, to be sold into slavery. And that was well documented recently during the 400th anniversary of that occurrence in the 1619 Project. So those initial Africans in Virginia, from what I understand, are the first people technically placed in bondage in the United States. So John Clay was already in Virginia by the time that happened. So he came to Virginia in 1613, I believe, or 1612. He acquired land in, I think it's called Charles City County. And then somehow the family migrated more toward the Richmond, Virginia area. And several generations down the line, there was an ancestor named Henry Clay. Henry Clay was the father of all of the Clays in Kentucky, and including my patriot, Green Clay, which was, I think he would be the grandson of Henry, and then U.S. Senator Henry Clay, who was a very powerful senator in our history, probably was in office for 40 years or more, and he was very impactful on Black people who were enslaved in America, and we can get into that in a minute. But my patriot, Green Clay, was in the Virginia House of Burgesses when the United States Constitution was proposed to the colonies for ratification. And he was one of the people that weighed in on ratifying the Constitution. And then from then, he was a little rebellious. I've been reading about him over the years, and he seems like a person very similar in personality to myself. I'm not a rebellious person, but just a person that was curious, and he seems to be somebody that would step out and try things. So he became a surveyor. I don't think he got along well with his father, whose name was Charles, I believe, and Charles Clay, and he broke off from his father and became a surveyor. And at that time, there were 13 original colonies, but the frontier of Virginia was to become the state of Kentucky. So my patriot took off to the frontier and surveyed it. And at that time, what you surveyed you became the owner of it. So he amassed a great deal of the state of Kentucky. So from what I'm reading, he was the largest landowner and the largest slave owner in the state of Kentucky. He was into agriculture. He was a farmer. And also he had businesses all around the state of Kentucky. So it could be a ferry business, across the river, various rivers in Kentucky. It could be a distillery. That was a big business for him. And he didn't stop. He kept expanding himself. He went into the state of Mississippi and had holdings down there as well, and maybe other places. But I just know of those two places where he was. So he was a bachelor until he was about 38 years old. And then he married Sally Payne Lewis, who was much younger. And she had quite a few children. And then from then on, that's where I descended from, that family. They were centered in what is now called Madison County.
The woman he married, she was white?
Yes, she was from a prominent Virginia family, and he was from a prominent Virginia family. And at that time, which really hasn't changed to this very day, but in the families that are farmers, and probably even in families that are more merchants or business people, you would marry well, quote unquote, well. That means somebody that could bring something to you in terms of assets and so forth. And that would help build these family dynasties, which still, what they did back then still resounds today. It still carries through today. I was talking with someone the other day about, what does slavery have to do with anybody today? And, we were talking about business, and I said, well, from what I understand, somebody has already done that research, and they're tracing, Carnegie, there's steel companies, clothing manufacturers, railroads, all of that traces back to cotton and sugarcane. And my point being that without the slaves, without free labor, America would not be as great and wealthy as it became. All of that is built. All of that can be traced back to the days when people gave their labor freely and worked so hard to build this country.
Green Clay, your ancestor was one of the largest slaveholders. How does that feel, descending from someone who owned so many people?
I don't feel one way or another about it. I just am grateful that I'm here today. And so I don't hold malice there. I'm just curious about him. I'm curious about how he thought. I think I have a good idea of how he thought. And I'm curious as to how I came into being and thinking the way I was thinking, because like I said, at a very young age, I knew I was very special. And it's got to be because of my ancestors to a certain extent, and also from myself, and what I do to a certain extent. So it's, is it nature or nurture that makes you who you are? I think it's a combination of both. And when I look at my mother, this is her family, that has that patriot that I applied under for the DAR, I see where she got her spirit, her drive, and it wasn't just from him. As a matter of fact, when I was putting together a presentation about a year ago, I spent about a year putting it together for a conference that occurred in 2019 in Ontario. I have lineage that goes to a place called the Elgin Settlement in Buxton, Ontario. And that settlement was a 9,000-acre tract of land set aside for the settlement of former and self-emancipated slaves. So one of my lines came from that area in Ontario. They have every year, and for the last 97 years, they have an event called Homecoming. And that event occurs on Labor Day weekend, starting on Friday, ending on Monday. And for the past several years, I have volunteered on a committee that puts together the Fight Friday program, which is a history and genealogy conference every year. And so last year was the first time I volunteered to give a presentation. And that presentation was called My Journey to the DAR. But in it, I talked about how my patriot actually related to the Elgin settlement and the interaction of the people, because as you do your genealogy work, you discover how interrelated we are as a people, as an American people, which is not well told, by the way, in schools. I'm really disappointed. I've learned so much on my own about our American history that no one even touches when you're coming through school. I think what you get is European American indoctrination in school for history, but you don't get the full picture unless you do a lot of work on your own. I'm so disappointed in that, because it's so rich and it gives you so much more understanding. It helps you understand people better. It helps you understand what it is to be an American better if you know the complete full picture about our history.
You were talking about how your ancestor, your patriot, Green Clay, was related or had some dealings with the Elgin settlement. How was he intertwined with the Elgin settlement in Ontario, where you said that was built for free people of color?
on my father's side, he is a descendant from a couple whose names are William and Eliza Parker.
Your father is a descendant of them.
Yes, my father is a descendant. So I'm kind of trying to easily relate what's happening with the Clay family with my other side of the family, okay? So with the Rowland side of the family. So he is a 2 times great-grandson of William and Eliza Parker. The Parkers were originally in bondage in the state of Maryland. William was around Anne Arundel County across from St. Anne. And if my memory serves me, I believe he was from a town near Davidsonville, Maryland. And he, at the age of 17, he self-emancipated himself and went to Pennsylvania and started a life there. And he was a person that people went to for protection and help. And he was an abolitionist. So in history, and his wife Eliza, her maiden name was Howard. Eliza Ann Elizabeth Howard Parker were abolitionists, but I don't think they met each other until they both self-emancipated and ended up in Pennsylvania. And the town where they lived was in Lancaster County. It was called Christiana, Pennsylvania. And I haven't been there in a few years, but what I recall, when you go to Christiana, Pennsylvania, the streets are lined with flags that say freedom began here. And it's because of an event that occurred at the home of William and Eliza Parker called the Christiana Riot. Sometimes it's called the Christiana Resistance. And that happened September 11th, 1851 in Christiana, Pennsylvania. And that date, it keeps popping up in my life constantly. I always look for patterns and I'm always analyzing it. But September 11th is when the Twin Towers went down in New York City. In fact, the first thought in my mind was it happened again, because that's the same day. It was at that time 150 years earlier where the Christiana Riot occurred. And what happened there was several slaves who had escaped their master, whose name was Edward Gorsuch, who lived in what is known today, I believe, as Sparks, Maryland. He came under the authority of the federal marshal and the federal law, which was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, to claim these fugitive slaves that had gone to my ancestors' home for protection. And I think there were 3 or 4 of those people. They had taken on different names by that time, because quite frequently when slaves escaped, they took a new name in freedom. They didn't retain their old names. And so all of these former slaves of Edward Gorsuch had new names. Okay, but he was able to locate them, and he showed up at my ancestors' home with the federal marshal and a few other people to reclaim these slaves. And there was a standoff that occurred at the home. My ancestor he was renting land from a family. Their name was Pannell. It's spelled Pownall.
So was this William who was renting?
Yes. So William and Eliza, as well as Eliza's sister and her sister's husband, their last name was Pinckney, lived together in this home that William and Eliza rented from the Pannell family. The Pannells were Quakers. And it was a few years ago on television that I learned some more information about that incident, because it was some of these genealogy shows that are on television. featured, quite often they feature a celebrity and they talk about their ancestry. And the celebrity was Zooey Deschanel, who is an actress, young person who is an actress. But I saw the promo and I said, sounds like she's getting ready to talk about my family history, you know? And so sure enough, that's what it was. I had alerted the family to turn on that show that night. And sure enough, they told the story of the Christiana Riot. So at any rate, Edward Gorsuch, the slave master, was quite insistent that these slaves be given up. William and Eliza were housing the slaves. They were taking care of them, protecting them for about a day or so, because they had quite an elaborate system of notification that they had developed. So they knew that there were slave catchers in the area. And so these slaves went to William for protection. And he was willing to do that. So when Edward Gorsuch showed up at his home, the discussion was between William Parker and Edward Gorsuch, the slave master. So William Parker refused to give up the slaves, and they were well fortified with arms. And actually, Eliza, she was not a weak person. She was no weak weenie. These were very strong people, very strong couple. She sounded the alarm to the community, and they had a system of notification that caused people to drop whatever they were doing and come to the sound of the alarm and come with some weapon. That's what they had worked out, because this area where they lived in Lancaster County was always getting raided with the law change, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So it was always getting raided, and so they knew what to do. So they say about 100 people showed up to William Parker's home, and so Edward Gorsuch was not intimidated by that for some reason. Some of them were black and some of them were white. Some of the people that showed up were black and some of them were Quakers, just observing. And so anyway, one thing led to another. And eventually, Edward Gorsuch, because he was too stubborn to go away, because he was being pleaded to by my ancestor to leave. If he knows what's good for him, leave. He wouldn't do it. He was insistent that the law was right, and he was in the right. And eventually, he lost his life. He was killed. And the people in his party either ran for their lives or they were pretty severely injured. Okay. And this incident has been documented in several books. I'm lucky because I got quite a bit of written material on both sides of my family about things that happened. So you're looking at like But We Have No Country by Ella Forbes. We're looking at Bloody Dawn by Thomas Slaughter. We're looking at the Christiana Riot, which documents the events and also the trials that occurred afterwards. It's by Hensel. There's quite a few things written about it, in addition to my ancestor himself, who eventually learned how to read and write, and he wrote a series of articles in the Atlantic Monthly that occurred, I think, 10 years after the riot. And it was like 2 or 3 articles that he wrote about his life, and they were autobiographical and described the event too. And then also other people described the event from what they knew of it, like Frederick Douglass devotes several pages of his memoir, My Life and Times, to describing the aftermath of the Christiana Riot. So as a result of that incident, William Parker and others fled the area because now they had in the eyes of the government, violated federal law. And also there was the issue of murder of the slave master. Okay. So the Quakers put William Parker Alexander Pinckney, the brother-in-law, and I can't remember if there was somebody else on the Underground Railroad. And the Underground Railroad doesn't mean that you were walking or, were moving at night necessarily. They put him on a train part of the way. Part of the way he was on a horse and wagon. Part of the way he was in a train. And they moved him north. And he ended up at the home of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass wrote about it and put him on a ferry to, I believe, Kingston, Ontario. And from Kingston, Ontario, my ancestor spoke with the governor. So he wanted to make sure he wasn't going to get extradited. And he was reassured that he wouldn't be extradited. And then William Parker migrated down toward the Elgin settlement, which it turned out to be one of the more successful settlements for former and emancipated slaves in Canada. So he took a parcel of land, 50 acres, on the 13th concession in the Elgin settlement, which is known today, we could just call it Buxton. But where we lived was South Buxton. We were near Lake Erie. And so he ended up settling there, and eventually Eliza and their children, who had been detained by, I don't know if it was state or federal officials, but they were detained in Pennsylvania. But eventually everybody's case got dismissed, and Eliza was released, and she and the children joined William Parker in the Elgin settlement. Now, how does Green Clay play into that? Green Clay was from a prominent political family in Kentucky, very powerful people. His father's first cousin was U.S. Senator Henry Clay. U.S. Senator Henry Clay was known as the Great Pacificator. He was a negotiator. He brokered a lot of laws. And one of the laws that he was responsible for brokering was a deal that he set for establishing the Fugitive Slave Act so that slave owners could go into other states that were free and reclaim their fugitive slaves. So Clay was very close to this particular cousin, U.S. Senator Henry Clay. And Green Clay was in the state of Kentucky with him, located nearby, maybe 20 miles away in Madison County, he was close to Richmond. And, his home is a public venue now. You can go and visit Green Clay's home. So we have a member of my family on one side that made this Fugitive Slave Act happen, and the member of my other side that defied that Fugitive Slave Act. And that's how my dad's side ended up in Canada for several generations. Here you have people in the same family on opposite sides. And even in the Clay family, they were on opposite sides. So Green Clay was a person that was in favor of slavery. Oh, by the way, Green Clay was a politician also in Kentucky as well. He was in the House of Burgesses in Virginia, but he was in the state. He was in the House and the Senate in Kentucky as well. So, so U.S. Senator Henry Clay was in favor of sending the slaves back to Africa. And then the third person in the family, who was the son of Green Clay, his name was Cassius Marcellus Clay. And he was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. And he was an abolitionist. So right in the same family, close relatives had totally different positions that they took on the issue of slavery. Cassius Clay is the brother of my ancestor, who is Brutus Clay. Cassius being the younger brother, Brutus being one of the older children of Green Clay. And, the plot thickens later on. I mean, even in the aftermath of the killing of Edward Gorsuch, the slave master, that occurred in Christiana, Edward had a son whose name was Thomas. And Thomas was not present in Christiana. He was young. Tom Gorsuch's best friend, or one of his best friends, was John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth learned of the killing of Tom's father from Tom, and it incensed him to the point where it fueled him for the next 10 years or more, 12 years, 13 years, to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln. So that's how small the world is and how interrelated we are. It's not the only thing that incensed him, but it was one of the things that he held that needed to be avenged. And then he ended up assassinating President Lincoln at Ford Theater.
How does your African ancestry come into existence?
It could be a couple of different ways, but the way that I proved was the son of Brutus Clay, the grandson of my patriot, was our father. So he also was a bachelor for a long time before he married his wife, whose name was Mary Brooks. But while he was young, about the age of 24, he impregnated my ancestral mother, whose name was Matilda Tillman, who was a servant at their place in Paris, Kentucky. So Green Clay's son, Brutus, had a son named Christopher Clay. They called him Kit Clay. Kit Clay was the father of all of us with Brutus's servant, Matilda Tillman. Kit Clay and Matilda Tillman are the couple.
She was of African descent?
Yes. So she was the servant. They called her a servant, slave, whatever you want to call it. I prefer the servant. Her mother, Amy, was the cook. Amy's mother was someone whose name was Winnie. And Winnie was, we're told, part Native American. Sometimes that's code for part European. So with regard to my ancestor, Matilda Tillman, sometimes she's referred to as Matilda Clay. In the books that are written by Cassius Clay's descendants, had several siblings, and one of them was a brother named Napoleon. And, we just referred to him as Uncle Pole, and he was a field slave. But he apparently, in the record, left Brutus's farm, which is Auvergne in Paris, Kentucky, several times to join the Union Army at Camp Nelson. And at Camp Nelson, whatever happened, he returned back to Paris. And when he did, on one occasion, they put a ball and chain on his leg. Whatever it was that they were cultivating or growing in the fields, and he was tending to in the fields, he had this ball and chain on his leg, and Matilda was assigned to roll that ball down the row with him as he worked. He got intoxicated one time in town, and he was picked up by the authorities and taken to the district court, where he was chastised by the judge because the judge evidently knew their dad, who his name, as far as I know in the record, is Emmanuel Tillman. The judge was saying, "Wouldn't your father be ashamed of you?" And he kept on in different ways talking about the shame you brought to your father and this and that and the other. And then so finally, after several minutes of this, the judge turns to Uncle Pole and says, "Well, what do you have to say for yourself?" And Uncle Pole just looked up and said, "My father liked to take a sip or two himself." So that kind of shut down the court, I think, when he said that. Matilda had 4 children with Kit Clay. The daughter that I descended from, her name was Lutetia. My ancestor, Lutetia, fell in love with a white man. He was a first-generation German American, and he was a grocer but he was very protective of his business. And so he couldn't give her a legal marriage. And that was one thing that always bothered her. It impacted also my application to the DAR because there were, number one, we had to coming out of slavery because Lutetia was a slave. There was a matter of, I don't know my exact birth date. There was a matter of what is my last. Kit Clay kind of cleared that up for us because he gave all the children his surname. So, but it took him a while to do that. And then the issues of not being able to be legally married causing the DAR to hiccup on my application. The problem was in the middle with my African ancestors because they were adjusting themselves in Reconstruction and in the early part of the 1900s. They had a lot of adjustments to do. So their paperwork wasn't to Hoyle according to the DAR in every case. So anyway, when I looked over the documents for approving my application, one of them was the last will and testament of my patriot, Green Clay. And as I was reading through, all these names were popping up that sounded very familiar to me. One of them being Amy. And Amy, in my oral history, is the daughter of the overseer. So I saw her name pop up. Okay, now I'm going to back up a step because the reason I started looking closer at Green Clay's last will and testament, because when I was reading the memoir of U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Cassius Marcellus Clay, he referred to a person who inspired him to be an abolitionist. And that person happened to be a servant of African descent, a servant on his father's farm, Claremont. And her name was Mary. So, Mary is a familiar name to me, very common name in that particular line. And so I looked into her a little bit more. And Mary was maybe 10 years older than Cassius Clay, but he loved her because she showed him how to lay out a garden and have, trees and, plants, that fruit-bearing trees and stuff like that. And he admired her and he described her in his memoir. And the description kind of stopped me short too, because the description included her features, her hair, and the thing that made me almost fall off my seat was that he said that he described a medical condition about her. He said her cheeks had a blush in them. And that medical condition is called rosacea, which is something that still afflicts us to this day. So I became interested in Mary. And as I read further on her, I discovered that she was involved in a lawsuit in about 1820. And I think she would have been not quite 20 years old when that lawsuit occurred. And what happened was that she was evidently a servant in Green and Sally Clay's home, my patriot's home. And she committed some minor infraction, and as a punishment, she was sent to cook for the overseer, whose name was John Payne. And John Payne was a drunkard. And he was abusive, verbally abusive to Mary, and Mary wasn't going to take it. And so she responded to him in such a way that he felt it was over the line, inappropriate, and to punish her and remedy that, he and his family plotted to kill Mary. I sent off to the archives in Frankfurt for what was left of the remains of that case. And so they sent me a diagram of the situation. So Mary was sent upstairs in the overseer's house, John Payne's house, to shuck corn upstairs. And the way the upstairs was situated was a series of 3 rooms. And in the case, it explained that all the escape routes from upstairs were nailed shut or blocked. She couldn't open a door, because it was nailed shut. So they sent her upstairs and she couldn't escape. And then shortly after she went up, but she knew that something was afoot. And so she placed a knife in her bosom. And so shortly after she went up to do this work, the family followed her up the steps. And she knew that she was going to have a problem. So she began running from room to room. Those 3 rooms were in succession in a line. So she went from room to room running, and it shows her trail on this diagram, and she couldn't get out. So she went to the first room, she couldn't get out. The second room, she couldn't get out. The third room, she was cornered. And so she drew this knife out and stabbed the overseer, John Payne, in the heart, and he died immediately. But in so doing, she was drenched in his blood. She ran back to Green Clay's house, drenched in blood and screaming. And shortly thereafter, that time, she was arrested and charged with the murder of John Payne. Her lawyer moved to change what they call change venue so that she could have a fair trial. They didn't think she could get a fair trial in Madison County, so they removed her. She was removed to Jessamine County, and she was placed in jail. The jail that Mary was placed in was an outdoor jail. It was exposed to the elements. And so she became very, very ill. It was horrible. They described what was happening to her. It was so gross. I don't repeat it, but she became very, very ill. Somehow Green Clay broke her out of that jail. Not broke her out, took her out of jail, took her back home, nursed her back to health. And then she stood trial, and her defense of self-defense, it's an affirmative defense in the law, didn't work with this jury. She was condemned to hang. And this was, her hanging date was approximately December 1st, of 1821. It must have been Green Clay prevailed upon his buddy, who was governor of the state of Kentucky, Governor John Adair. And John Adair pardoned Mary. Mary was pardoned, so she wasn't hung, and she was released back to Green Clay. Green took her back to Claremont, and that's where she spent the rest of her days until Green died. And then also another side note, in his memoir, Cassius Clay mentions or projects that Mary was actually Green Clay's daughter. So that would be his half-sister. So that kind of was making sense to me after also investigating the outcome of her legal case and the extent to which somebody, it might have been Green, it might have been somebody else, but somebody came to her rescue and she wasn't hung. Okay. So in investigating in Green Clay's will, then all these names are popping out. So Amy, upon Green Clay's death, goes to the daughter in Lexington. I think her name was Sally too, Sarah or Sally. And then as I read further, so then from Mary, I backed up and looked at the names that preceded her. The next name was Isabel. Isabel is a repeated name in my family as well. It turned into Annabelle recently, but back then it was Isabel. So my ancestor's sister was Isabel. And then my ancestor's granddaughter, downstream granddaughter, descendant was Annabelle. So Annabelle, it became Annabelle. But back then, if you were Isabel, they probably called you Belle. All right, the next name to Isabel was Grace. That's not a familiar name to me. And the next name next to Grace is Winnie. And I was told Winnie is the name of my ancestor. and she was to be sold. And the next name to her was her husband, Daniel. But Daniel, according to my oral history, is not my bio dad. But she may have had a husband named Daniel. We do have some oral history about her husband. And the oral history about whoever Winnie's husband was that he was sent back to Africa, to Liberia. Okay? And they never saw him again. So Winnie, I don't know how I would ever prove it, but with those kinds of names in that will, I'm thinking that we went back with Green Clay for several generations and that we were servants in the house close to him and possibly his children, or possibly, some kind of relative. Okay.
What was Green Clay's Revolutionary War service?
He was a lieutenant in the Revolution in Virginia, and he was the brigadier general over the Kentucky militia for the War of 1812. And he served as commander over the Battle of Fort Meigs in Ohio.
What made you go on to actually join the DAR? You mentioned that your mother said, "Don't we qualify?" But how did you progress from, yes, acknowledging that you do qualify to proceeding with the application?
Yeah, my mother is the one. I wouldn't have done it had she not said, it wouldn't have occurred to me to do that. But once she mentioned it to me or asked me if we were eligible, then I thought it was probably a good idea because I've done a lot of research. I've got so much boxes of information and I really don't have a good place for it. And there's no obvious inheritor of it because I think I'm like in the family, one of the main people that are interested in genealogy to that kind of extent. So I don't have anybody to pass it to. So I needed to, at that point, I thought it would be good to put my lineage into some kind of long-lasting institution. The DAR was formed in about 1890. It is a long-lasting institution. It has a library. It has a facility to keep information. So I thought this was one way to preserve this history, and I think it's interesting history and important history, and give a fuller picture of what was really happening in America. Even though my patriot is of European descent, I'm of African descent and European descent both. And I think that my perspective provides a lot more enrichment to what was actually happening at that time when the formation of America, the United States of America, occurred.
How do you respond to people, or what do people say when you tell them that you're a member of the DAR?
What do people say? Well, initially, I had the same experience as as far as I know, there are only 2 of us in the state of Michigan of African descent, and I've known the other person for many years because she grew up with my husband. And I remember when she had just applied or was applying to the DAR. And I think that her experience and mine were similar in that a lot of people would ask, why are you doing that? Because they view the DAR as being a very conservative, exclusive organization and not really interested in preserving or knowing about, I'll say that, and knowing about the ancestry of people that didn't descend from Britain or Europe, So I initially received some flack about it, but as I engaged with the DAR in my application, they were very helpful to me in clarifying some things or making it more acceptable format-wise to the organization to make it easier to approve it, because the way I would say things might not be the way that the DAR would want to see it. And, they were helpful on, the person-to-person contact that I had with the DAR members, they were helpful to me in my application, but they did tell me, but I was used to it because it's been my whole life. They did tell me about their apprehension about my application. And they told me that the state officials had their eye on it. But, you know, it's the same basic thing that I've been told at anything that I've done, you know, that makes you feel like you're under a microscope to a certain extent. So my former experiences prepared me for that. And so I just proceeded full speed ahead on it. I had all the information already, so it wasn't that hard to put together my application. But after I submitted my application, then I began getting these rounds of questioning. And so from beginning to end, it took 7 months to approve my application because of the rounds of questioning that I got. And I almost didn't complete it because I already gave all the information that was required. And then the rest of the questions I felt were, from my perspective, asked me to prove it by another way, you know, which I gave the basic documents that you have to give are birth records, death records, and marriage records. And then if you don't have a marriage record, you could use any other state documents to show, you know, that there was a biological relationship, which I did. But then I was asked some other questions and had to go creatively figure out a way to answer those questions. At one round, I gave the basic documentation on this one level. But then I was asked, how do you know that's your ancestor? So it kind of makes you pause and think. If I gave you that information, if I gave you a marriage record, and then they come back and say, how do you know that's your ancestor? Do you follow me? It was kind of hard. I was able to answer it, but it was hard. And then at another point, I was asked to look collaterally at siblings to see what was on their state records and supply that. And then at another stage, I was asked to look into home records, home sale records like deeds in the North to see if there was any biographical data in those records. So, which I wouldn't expect there to be any, but then there wasn't any. And so in some cases, it wasn't even available, you know, because it was, the information would be too old or whatever. It wasn't even available. So I did what I could to answer the question. And then eventually, I did have a letter, a postcard that I submitted. So it showed that there was a relationship to the people in Kentucky and from the Clay family, from the European Clay family. And there were some other things. I had to do an affidavit from my mother, who is 90 years old. She's still living, and she was able to give an affidavit, and I supplied that. And then I guess that was enough so that they felt like they could approve my application, but it was kind of clear to me that they were uncomfortable approving the application. But my local registrar explained it to me. She says, well, they really don't know who you are. You know, we know who you are, but they don't know who you are. So just do your best to answer the question. So that's what I did.
Some genealogists find that scrutiny, that rigorous review, to be of great pride, to say that because the DAR does such due diligence, that it is one of the top reviews that you can have over your lineage. And some of the people who have spent a long time researching appreciate that level of detail is exercised in order to validate one's history. Did you not feel that was the process that they were undertaking?
No, like I said, my local registrar explained to me that they don't know who I am. So I have to answer the questions. And it was, I guess for me, it harkened back to what my great-grandmother and my grandmother told me when I was 7, because they died right within a couple years after they told me that don't talk about it because nobody will believe you. And so it kind of, it's for a person of African descent, it's it can feel traumatizing, but I understood it. And like I said, it's not the first time that I had been under scrutiny, so I had the shoulders for it. But it is re-traumatizing. And as a genealogist, if you're a good one, you're experiencing everybody's life that you are researching. As you're researching, you're going through their hurt, you're going through their joy, you're going through what they had to go through in order to make their place in the world. And it's not an easy process. It's almost like you're suffering when you're doing your genealogy work. So as I was being questioned, I'm reliving my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, her mother, her mother, her mother. Because to get back to Revolutionary War, I had to go back eight generations, So it's a lot of people's lives. And even the people, the Clays, who are English, they're British, living their lives were, from their perspective, I can see where they could feel like they had a very hard row to hoe. And their determination and the African ancestors' determination and just coming through it with no support on the African. The Africans had no support. So having all these kids and then being responsible to raise these children with no help, and you're a woman, and in the times to have that responsibility, because I told you what it was like for my mother. She was the only wife that I knew that worked outside of the home. There were no jobs for you, so being an African person, you're even more limited, because the kind of jobs that you would have to do to earn a living, you would be worked to death and still not have enough. So, and then to be left with nothing. That's why they came up north. They left Kentucky because there was nothing for them after emancipation. They were all put eventually, not immediately, but eventually they were put into a slave settlement in Paris, Kentucky. And it was called Claysville. And, there was a lot of talent in that community. So one of my ancestors, who is a woman, because basically after Kit Clay got married and bowed out of our life, and, basically from then on, I descended from women, it was like a woman, not a male involved. So they were put into Claysville, was the name of the settlement. And in that settlement, someone arose from there whose name is Garrett Morgan, a famous inventor, the one that invented the tricolor traffic light. His invention of the gas mask was used in World War I. He invented hair products and so forth, and my heart just about broke. I heard a presentation at Homecoming in Buxton this year. We did a virtual conference this year, and one of the presenters was talking about hair products that were developed in Reconstruction, after the freeing of the slaves. And basically my heart broke, and I held on to that for a couple of days because I just absorb. I'm empathetic, I absorb people's issues, and as an attorney, same thing. But they were saying that the presenter was saying that after during that Reconstruction period, the reason why they needed hair products developed is because of the nutrition problems that the formerly enslaved people had, and also stress. It took effect.
You were reliving this stress and this trauma from past generations and from the ancestors that you had researched and connected with through your research during your application process.
Yes, especially when I got questioned. They believed what I gave them, but they wanted me to prove it again by some other means.
Once you became a member, was it worth it to go through that?
My goal was to get my lineage documented in an institution that was long-lasting, so yes.
Have you been involved as a member since you joined?
Yes.
What kind of activities have you done with the chapter?
They usually ask me to take a chairmanship, which I have been doing for since 2017 when I was admitted.
What type of chairmanships have you done?
I did the insignia chairmanship the first year, and then now I'm women's issues.
What does being a DAR member mean to you?
For me, it means that my lineage, both the African and the European lineage, goes back to the beginning or before the beginning of the United States of America. So my roots are very deep in this country. I belong here, and I don't absorb or agree with people that are trying to, eject me or anybody else who's an American citizen from America. And right now is one of those times when it's being tried again. And if I leave, I'll go voluntarily. I'm not going to be forced to leave. This is my home. This is where my ancestors are buried, a lot of them. And, I plan to stake my ground. I'm not leaving. And I want to stand up for other people that are weaker than me, because I think, you can get scared. And the terror is something that goes deep with Africans. Terror, reliving terror, and being afraid to travel, being afraid to do normal things. So yeah, I'm very glad that I'm putting my stakes in the ground for my family, and they're happy I'm doing it. Actually, it makes them, they don't want to do the research, but they're very happy to know where they're grounded. So
what does having that Revolutionary War ancestor mean to you? You just explained it in terms of you're staking your ground, that you belong here and basically no one's going to make you leave. Does it make you identify any differently? Does it make you feel a different way about yourself?
My ancestor is like all of us. He had strengths and he had a lot of faults. And he was successful overall, but he also had a lot of failure. He had a lot of personal failure. So I humanize him, and I respect him as my ancestor, and he helps me understand how I got to the point in my life that I became who I am. So I appreciate all my ancestors. It's not just him. It's not him over anybody else, in other words. But I can appreciate what he went through in his life.